The light of June 1944 did not arrive with a sudden burst of summer heat, but rather with a grey, suffocating dampness that clung to the stone walls of southern England. In the coastal towns of Dorset and Devon, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool, and the metallic temps of thousands upon thousands of tons of oiled machinery that was a weight to the silence in those final days, a pressure that seemed to push against the chests of the young men who filled every barn, every schoolhouse, and every hidden lane leading to the sea. They were no longer individuals with names, and they had become part of a singular, massive organism, a giant coiled spring held back by the capricious whims of the North Atlantic weather. They sat on their kit bags leaning against the damp brick of village pubs that had been shuttered for watching the rain streak the windows. To understand the scale of this moment, one must look not at the maps, but at the sensory details of the soldier's world. It was the sound of a whetstone scrapping against a bayonet, a rhythmic hypnotic shing-shing that filled the quiet of the tents. It was the smell of the debar, the dense, bitter chocolate ration that tasted of wax and zuga meant to provide energy when there was no time to eat. These men were surrounded by a landscape that had been transformed into a fortress of logistics. The green hedgerows of England were hidden behind stacks of ammunition crates, reaching 6 feet high, stretching for miles down country roads like new wooden walls. Welcome to the precipice of the longest day. This is a journey into the soul of an invasion, a descent into the hours where the fate of Western civilization rested on the thickness of a cloud layer and the courage of men who were mostly still teenagers. We're not here to rush through the gunfire. We are here to sit with them in the cold, to feel the vibration of the ship's hull against our spines, and to hear the wind howling through the rigging of the greatest fleet ever assembled. Across the water, the coast of France sat in a different kind of silence. The Atlantic wall was not merely a line of bunkers. It was a psychological weight. It was a labyrinth of reinforced concrete, some walls 10 feet thick, buried deep into the sand and rock. The German sentries looked out over the same grey water, squinting through the salt spray. They had been told for years that the invasion was coming, yet the horizon remained empty, a flat, mocking expanse of nothingness. The tension was a physical presence. In the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander Southwick House, the floorboards creaked under the weight of restless pacing. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was a man defined by the cigarette smoke that swirled around him in the flickering lamplight. He was surrounded by weather map swirling patterns of isobars that looked like chaotic thumbprints. The meteorologists are the high priests of this moment. They spoke of low-pressure systems and stiff gales as if they were naming demons. On June 4th, the order had been given to move, only to be clawed back at the last second. The mechanical gears of the invasion had already begun to turn. Ships were already pitching in the mid-channel chop. Soldiers were already vomiting into their helmets from seasickness, only to be told to turn back. The anticlimax was agonizing. It was a phantom limb of a battle, a false start that left everyone drained and hollow. But on the evening of June 5th, a brief window was spotted, a lull in the storm. It was a fragile, fleeting opportunity. Eisenhower, his face etched with lines that seemed to have deepened overnight, looked at his commanders. The room was silent, save for their rain lashing against the window panes. He waited. He thought of the thousands of men already sealed inside their ships, floating in the dark. He thought of the paratrooper cellities smearing burnt cork on their faces. Then, he spoke 2 words that would set the world on fire. "Okay, let's go." Immediately, the silence of England was shattered. It began as a low hum, a vibration in the soles of the feet that grew into a chest-thumping roar. Thousands of engines, Merlins, radials, Allisons, were sparked into life. The air became thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel and burnt oil. On a dozen airfields, the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions began the slow, the agonizing process of suiting up. The weight of a paratrooper's gear was nearly equal to his own body weight. Their Wereth parachutes, their reserve chutes, the M1 Garand rifles broken down in Griswold bags, the grenades, the knives taped to ankles, the rations, the extra socks, and the cricket clickers. They moved like deep-sea divers on dry land, swaying under the mass, helping one another climb the short metal steps into the bellies of the C-47S. Inside the planes, the atmosphere was a strange mix of high-voltage adrenaline and accrushing, quiet intimacy. Men who had spent months boasting and joking were nowsland. Some chewed tobacco until their jaws ached. Others stared at the vibrating. They were wrapped in a dim red light, the jump light that bathed the cabin in a bloody hue. The roar of the engines drowned out conversation, leaving each man alone with his thoughts as the planes lifted off, one by one, into the turbulent night ski. Below them, the English Channel was no longer a waterway. It was a city of steel moving south. 5,000 ships. It is a number that the mind struggles to visualize. There were massive battleships like the USS Texas and HMS Spite, their great guns looming like prehistoric beasts. There were cruisers, destroyers, and the countless flat-bottomed LSTs and LCs that would carry the infantry to the shore. For the infantrymen on these ships, the experience was one of pure, rhythmic misery. The flat bottoms of the landing craft were never meant for the open sea, especially not a sea whipped up by a dying gale. The boats did not just roll, They bucked and slammed out. Every few seconds the bow would drop into a trough, hitting the bottom of the wave with a sound like a sledgehammer striking steel. A spray of freezing salt water would erupt over the ramp, soaking the men to the bone. The smell inside those boats was a foul cocktail of diesel fumes, vomit, and wet canvas. There was nowhere to sit, nowhere to move. They stood huddled together, shoulder to shoulder, their rifles held upright like a forest of steel. In the dark, you couldn't see the man next to you, but you could feel his shivering, a steady, involuntary vibration that passed from soldier to soldier until the entire boat seemed to be trembling as the fleet crossed the halfway point, the point of no return. The ships began to peel off toward their assigned beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The navigation was a miracle of timing. Amidst the pitch-black night and the tossing waves, thousands of vessels had to find their specific lanes without the use of lights or radio. They followed the dim, blue glow of the stern light of the ship ahead, a tiny flick of color in a world of monochrome gray. While the ships moved, the first wave of the invasion was already falling from the sky, over the Cotentin Peninsula and the Orne River Valley. The C-47s hit the wall of German anti-aircraft fire. To the paratroopers inside, it sounded like gravel being thrown against a tin roof. The lethal ping of shrapnel tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. Then came the jump. The green light flashed. The prop blast hit them like a pistol blow, a 110-mile-per-hour wind that snatched the breath from their lungs. For a few scans there was chaos, the snap of the silk, the jerk of the harness, and then a sudden terrifying silence. They were drifting through a void. The only sound was the distant drone of the retreating planes and the whistling of the wind in their risers. The landscape they landed in was a nightmare of flooded marshes and tangled hedges. Many paratroopers found themselves alone, miles from their drop zones, splashing into waist-deep water. Every splash sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of a bush was a potential enemy. They moved through the shadows, clutching their crickets, clicking twice and waiting, praying to hear 2 clicks in return. As the clock ticked toward 5 a.m., the first hints of light began to touch the east. It wasn't a clear sunrise. It was a gradual thinning of the darkness into a cold, bruised purple. Off the coast, the great battleships finally slowed. Their massive turrets began to rotate with a slow, grinding groan of hydraulic fluid. The sailors on deck stood back, fingers in ears, mouths open to equalize the pressure. Then, the world ended. The first salvo from the HMS Warspite tore through the air with a sound like a freight train screaming overhead. The concussive blast flattened the water around the ship for hundreds of yards. Across the horizon, ship after ship joined in our rhythmic thumping that felt as if the earth itself were being beaten with a hammer. The bombardment was meant to shatter the concrete bunkers and paralyze the defenders, but as the smoke began to drift over the water, it became clear that the Atlantic wall was not so easily broken. In the landing craft, the men heard the shells passing over them. It was a comforting sound at first, the big brothers providing cover, but as the boats drew closer to the shore, the naval fire had to lift to avoid hitting the troops. In that sudden gap of silence, a new sound emerged, a high-pitched mechanical chatter. The MG-42s, the Germansche, had survived the shelling. They were at their guns, and they were waiting. The ramps were about to drop. The water in front of the boats was being whipped into a frenzy by falling bullets, looking like a pond in a heavy rainstorm. The men adjusted their helmets, gripped their rifles until their knuckles turned white, and took one last breath of the salty, diesel-choked air. They were no longer the invasion force on a map. They were individuals, cold and terrified, standing at the threshold of a new and violent world. The tide was coming in. The obstacles were being submerged by the rising gray water. The distance between the boats and the sand was closing. 500 yards, 300, 100. The metal hull scraped against the sand with a jarring, screeching halt. The winch groaned. The heavy steel ramp began to fall, hitting the water with a splash that signaled the end of the wait, and the beginning of the end of Thua. The transition from the relative safety of the steel-walled landing craft to the open air of the surf was not a single moment, but a blurring of sensory overloads. When the ramps finally hit the water, the sound was not a bang but a hollow, metallicted that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the ocean and the frantic, staccato hit of machine gun fire. The men in the front rank did not step out. They were pushed by the collective momentum of the frightened, determined mass behind them. To step into the water of Omaha or Juneau was to step into a medium that felt heavier than. It was a churning slurry of cold, brine sand and the slick, iridescent sheen of spilled oil. The weight of the gear, which had been a nuisance in the staging areas of England, now became a mortal enemy. A soldier carrying a radio or a mortar plate found himself suddenly submerged in a runnel, a deep trench in the sand carved out by the tide. In an instant the world turned from the gray of the sky to the green-black of the underwater. The silence beneath the surface was a terrifying contrast to the din above. Men struggled against their straps, their fingers fumbling with buckles made slick by salt water, as the weight of their own ammunition and supplies threatened to pull them into its silt forever. Many had to abandon their primary weapons just to reach the air, surfacing with gasping lungs only to find themselves in a landscape where the air itself seemed made of lead. The beach was not the flat, open expanse seen in training films. It was a chaotic obstacle course of iron and wood. The Czech hedgehogs, heavy beams of steel bolted together in a star shape, stood like skeletal sentinels in the surf. To the soldiers, these were the only cathedrals of safety available. They scrambled toward them, huddling behind the cold iron as bullets pinged and zipped against the metal. The sound of a bullet hitting a steel obstacle just inches from one's ear is a sound that vibrates through the bone of the skull, a high-pitched harmonic ringing that never truly leaves the memory. Between the water and the distant bluffs lay a wide, killing expanse of shingle, small, smooth stones that shifted and slid under the weight of a boot. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. The sound of thousands of boots scrambling over the shingle created a low, grinding roar that sat beneath the sharper cracks of the rifles. Above, on the heights of Point du Hoc and the bluffs of Kovel-Surma, the German defenders sat behind 3 feet of reinforced concrete. To them, the Americans and British below did not look like an invading army. They looked like ants struggling in a basin of sand. The German MG-4 machine guns, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw because of their incredible rate of fire, didn't sound like individual shots. They sounded like the tearing of a giant celestial piece of fabric. The catalyst, the true shift from a chaotic landing to an organized invasion, began not with the general's command, but with the quiet, desperate initiatives of NCOs, and, on the shingle of Omaha Beach, men lay paralyzed by what psychologists will later call the shell shock of the shore. They were pinned down by a lethargy of. It was here that the tone of the day changed. A sergeant, his uniform shredded by wire, his face masked in the fine white dust of pulverized stone, would scream over Thuand, "There are 2 kinds of people on this beach, those who are dead, and those who are going to die. Now let's get moving." It was the sound of human will grinding against friction of impossible odds. The transition from the beach to the inland was barred by shingle banks and rolls of concertina wire that caught on clothing like the claws of a beast. Engineers, the unsengaged of the breakthrough, crawled forward on their stomachs. They didn't carry it. They carried long hollow pipes filled with explosives, Bangalore torpedoes. They slid these pipes under the wire with the delicacy of a jeweler. Even as the sand around them was kicked up by machine gun fire, the explosion of a Bangalore is a singular event, a sharp, localized crack followed by a fountain of dirt and wire that clears a path barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. As the wire was breached, the focus shifted to the draws, the narrow gullies that led from the beach up to the plateau above. These were the natural funnels of the landscape, and the Germans had zeroed in every mortar and machine gun to cover them. To enter a draw was to enter a throat of fire. The air here was different. It was strapped between the earthen walls, thick with the smell of cordite and the sweet sickle scent of burnt vegetation. The soldiers moved in short, frantic bursts, rushing from the cover of a dead tank to a crater, their breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. Meanwhile, several miles inland, the catalyst was taking a different shape in the dark woods and flooded fields of the French countryside. The paratroopers who had dropped hours earlier were finding their footing. The confusion that had plagued their drop was now becoming their greatest weapon. Because they were scattered of year, the German high command believed the invasion was 10 times larger than it actually was. In the pre-dawn shadows of Saint-Miraglise, the battle was a series of ghostly encounters. A paratrooper would hear a footstep on the cobblestones click his metal cricket once, and wait for the response. If silence followed, he would fire in the dark. The town of Saint-Miraglise became a surreal theater of war. A paratrooper as Silkwood had caught on the stone steeple of the church, leaving him dangling in the air, a helpless observer to the chaos below. The church bell was ringing a frantic, clanging alarm that drowned out the screams and the gunfire. Below him, the town square was a nightmare of shadows and muzzle flashes. The Germans were firing at shadows, and the Americans were emerging from the hedgerows like forest spirits. This was the moment the war began to crack from the inside. By mid-morning, the catalyst had reached the German 7th Army's headquarters. The shift was a failure of communication. The German commanders were trapped in apridocs. They could see the ships. They could hear the reports of paratroopers, but they could not move their most powerful weapon, the panzer divisions. These tanks were held in OKW reserve, meaning only Adolf Hitler himself could authorize their release. And on the morning of June 6th, the man who held the fate of the Atlantic Wall in his chains was asleep in his mountain retreat. Having taken a sedative the night before, his staff was too terrified to wake him. The world was screaming, and the one man who could respond was lost in a drug-induced slumber. Back on the beaches, the sea was beginning to win a different kind of battle. The tide was rising, pushing the remaining soldiers against the seawall. The wreckage of the first wave, the burning tanks, the shattered boats, the discarded crates of rations was being pushed up the sand by the relentless water. The Omaha that the second wave arrived at was a landscape of ruins. But amidst the wreckage, a new resolve washed. Destroyers, seeing the plight of the infantry, he began to do the unthinkable. They steered their ships dangerously close to the shore, their hulls scraping the sand, so they could fire their 5-inch guns point-blank into the German pillboxes. The sound of these naval guns at such close range was a physical assault. It shattered the glass in the bunkers and collapsed the lungs of the men inside. Under the cover of this suicide run by the destroyers, the infantry began to claw their way up the bluffs. They weren't using sophisticated tactics now, where they were using their fingernails and their toes, digging into the sandy soil, dragging their bodies upward yard by yard. They were leaving the beach behind, moving from the world of the sea to the world of the land, a world of French hedgerows, stone farmhouses, and a conflict that was about to turn from a landing into a siege. The shift was complete. The great secret was out. The Atlantic wall, once thought tobe an impregnable shield, had been pierced in a dozen places. The men who had spent years preparing for this day were now standing on French soil, their boots caked in a mixture of English mud and Norman sand. They looked back at the sea and saw a horizon that was no longer empty, but filled with a forest of masts and a bridge of ships that stretched all the way back to the horizon. The door to Europe had been kicked open, but as the sun began to climb higher behind the clouds, the soldiers realized that the room they had just entered was filled with shadows. The transition from the salt-sprayed chaos of the shore to the interior of Normandy was like stepping into a different century. Beyond the smoking ruins of the beach defenses lay the bocage, a landscape of ancient, suffocating greenery that had been cultivated for 1,000 years. To the eye of a mapmaker, these were merely fields, but to the soldier on the ground, they were a labyrinth of organic fortresses. The hedgerows of Normandy were not the manicured bushes of an English garden. They were massive earthen embankments, some 5 or 6 feet high, topped with a dense, interlocking tangle of hawthorn, oak, and bramble roots that had grown so thick they were as impenetrable as iron dot in these sunken lanes. The world became very small and very quiet. The roar of the naval guns was muffled by the heavy dampness of the earth, replaced by the intimate sounds of the French countryside, the drip of rain from a leaf, the distant lowing of a cow left and milked, and the soft, rhythmic thwack of a machete cutting through vines. The air was different here. It was stagnant and humid, smelling of wet hay, manure, and thephany, sweet scent of apple orchards. The soldiers of the 29th and 1st Divisions moved in single file, their eyes darting to every break in the foliage. In the bocage you did not see your enemy until you were within 20 yards of him. It was a war of shadows, where a single sniper hidden in the hollow of an ancient tree could hold up an entire company for hours. Life in the journey inland became a series of small, isolated struggles. The grand strategy of the generals in London felt a million miles away. For the private in the foxhole, the invasion was the struggle to keep his socks dry and the constant gnawing hunger that the wax-covered rations could never quite satisfy. They learned the language of the land. They learned that a certain bird's call might mean a German patrollers moving through the tall grass, and that the clatter of a wooden shutter in a nearby farmhouse could be a signal or merely the wind. The French civilians they encountered were like ghosts appearing from the mist, elderly women in black shawls who offer rid canteens of sharp, burning calvados, their faces a mixture of liberation and the terror of what the coming days would bring to their homes. The mechanical monsters of the war, the tanks, found themselves humbled by the Norman earth. The Shermans, designed for the open plains of North Africa or the rolling hills of Sicily, were trapped in the lanes. Their long barrels would catch on the overhanging branches, and their thin belly armor was exposed every time they tried to climb over a hedgerow. The Germans, hiding on the other side with their Panzerfausts, waited for that moment of vulnerability. It was a slow, grinding process of evolution. Men became engineers out of necessity, welding Culin cutters heavy steel, death mode from the very German obstacles they had cleared, on the beach, onto the front of their tanks to rip through the roots of the earth itself. That as the sun began to set on the first few days of the campaign, the landscape took on a surreal haunted beauty. The smoke from burning villages drifted across the fields, mingling with the evening fog to create a heavy, purple haze. The soldiers would dig in for the night, scraping shallow holes into the flinty soil. They slept in shifts, one man watching the dark line of the hedge while the other drifted into a fitful shallow slumber, dreaming of the white cliffs of Dover or the cornfields of Iowa. The silence of the night was never absolute. It was punctuated by the crump of distant mortar and the eerie, greenish glow of flares that hung in the sky like dying stars, illuminating a world that had become a patchwork of blood and clover. The deeper they moved into Normandy, the more they realized that the journey was as much about the culture they were passing through as the combat they were enduring. They passed through villages where the stone crosses of the Middle Ages stood next to burned-out husks of half-track trucks. They saw the remnants of the German occupation signs in Gothic script, abandoned bunkers decorated with lace curtains stolen from local homes, and the strange, discarded luxury of the master race found in the cellars, bottles of fine Bordeaux and crates of silk stockings. It was a collision of worlds, the modern industrial might of the new world grinding against the ancient, layered history of the old. The journey was not just forward, but upward, as they struggled to take the high ground that dominated the valleys. Every hill had a number: Hill 192, Hill 122, and every number represented a week of life, 1,000 gallons of fuel, and a mountain of the soldiers became experts in the geology of death. They knew which soil would hold a trench and which would crumble under fire. They learned the sound of the German screaming mimes, the multi-barreled rockets that wailed through the air with a sound that tore at the nerves. In the face of this, the men developed a dark, dry humor, a way of speaking that turned the horror into something manageable. A series of inside jokes shared in the rain. By the end of the first week, the bridgehead had become a permanent fixture. The beaches were now massive ports, with artificial mulberry harbors being towed across sea and sunk into place. The journey inland was now supported by a river of steel trucks, jeeps, and ambulances flowing in a constant stream toward the front. Yet at Venice, the power of the Allies grew. The bocage remained an equalizer. In those green tunnels, a boy with a rifle was still the master of his destiny, and the journey toward the heart of France remained a matter of inches, won by the sweat of the brow and the rhythmic pulse of a world that had forgotten the meaning of peace. The transition from the salt-sprayed chaos of the shore to the interior of Normandy was like stepping into a different century. Beyond the smoking ruins of the beach defenses lay the bocage, a landscape of ancient, suffocating greenery that had been cultivated for 1,000 years. To the eye of a mapmaker, these were merely fields, but to the soldier on the ground, they were a labyrinth of organic fortresses. The hedgerows of Normandy were not the manicured bushes of an English garden. They were massive earthine embankments, some 5 or 6 feet high, topped with a dense, interlocking tangle of hawthorn, oak, and bramble roots that had grown so thick they were as impenetrable as iron. In these sunken lanes, the world became very small and very quiet. The roar of the naval guns was muffled by the heavy dampness of the earth, replaced by the intimate sounds of the French countryside, the drip of rain from a leaf, the distant lowing of a cow left unmilked, and the soft, rhythmic thwack of a machete cutting through vines. The air was different here. It was stagnant and humid, smelling of wet hay, manure, and the sweet scent of apple orchards. The soldiers of the 29th and 1st Divisions moved in single file, their eyes darting to every break in the foliage. In the bocage you did not see your enemy until you were within 20 yards of him. It was a war of shadows, where a single sniper hidden in the hollow of an ancient tree could hold up an entire company for hours. Life in the journey inland became a series of small, isolated struggles. The grand strategy of the generals in London felt 1,000,000 miles away. For the private in the foxhole, the invasion was the struggle to keep his socks dry and the constant, gnawing hunger that the wax-covered rations could never quite satisfy. They learned the language of the land. They learned that a certain bird's call might mean a German patrol was moving through the tall grass, and that the clatter of a wooden shutter in a nearby farmhouse could be a signal or merely the wind. The French civilians they encounter were like ghosts appearing from the mist, elderly women in black shawls who offered canteens of sharp, burning calvados, their faces a mixture of liberation and the terror of hut. The coming days would bring to their homes the mechanical monsters of the war. The tanks found themselves humbled by the Norman earth. The Shermans, designed for the open plains of North Africa or the rolling hills of Sicily, were trapped in the lanes. Their long barrels would catch on the overhanging branches, and their thin belly armor was exposed every time they tried to climb over a hedgerow. The Germans, hiding on the other side with their Panzerfausts, waited for that moment of vulnerability. It was a slow, grinding process of evolution. Men became engineers out of necessity, welding coolant cutters heavy steel, tethmet from the very German obstacles they had cleared, on the beach onto the front of their tanks to rip through the roots of the earth itself. As the sun began to set on the first few days of the campaign, the landscape took on a surreal haunted beauty. The smoke from burning villages drifted across the fields, mingling with the evening fog to create a heavy, purple haze. The soldiers would dig in for the night, scraping shallow holes into the flinty soil. They slept in shifts, one man watching the dark line of the hedge while the other drifted into a fitful, shallow slumber, dreaming of the white cliffs of Dover or the cornfields of Iowa. The silence of the night was never absolute. It was punctuated by the crump of distant mortar and the eerie, greenish glow of flares that hung in the sky like dying stars, illuminating a world that had become a patchwork of blood and clover. The deeper they moved into Normandy, the more they realized that the journey was as much about the culture they were passing through as the combat they were enduring. They passed through villages where the stone crosses of the Middle Ages stood next to burned-out husks of half-track trucks. They saw the remnants of the German occupation signs in Gothic script, abandoned bunkers decorated with lace curtains stolen from local homes, and the strange, discarded luxury of the master race found in the cellars, bottles of fine Bordeaux and crates of silk stockings. It was a collision of worlds, the modern, industrial might of the new world grinding against the ancient, layered history of the old. The journey was not just forward, but upward. As they struggled to take the high ground that dominated the valleys, every hill had a number: Hill 192, Hill 122, and every number represented a week of life, 1,000 gallons of fuel, and a mountain of spent. The soldiers became experts in the geology of death. They knew which soil would hold a trench and which would crumble under fire. They learned the sound of the German screaming mimes, the multi-barreled rockets that wailed through the air with a sound that tore at the nerves. In the face of this, the men developed a dark, dry humor, a way of speaking that turned the horror into something manageable. A series of inside jokes shared in the rain. By the end of the first week, the bridgehead had become a permanent fixture. The beaches were now massive ports, with artificial mulberry harbors being towed across sea and sunk into place. The journey inland was now supported by a river of steel trucks, jeeps, and ambulances flowing in a constant stream toward the front. Yet even as the power of the Allies grew, the bocage remained an equalizer. In those green tunnels, a boy with a rifle was still the master of his destiny, and the journey toward the heart of France remained a matter of inches, won by the sweat of the brow and the rhythmic pulse of a world that had forgotten the meaning of peace. The deeper the Allied forces pushed into the heart of the Calvados region, the more they were transformed into an intimate, claustrophobic struggle. If the beach was a moment of industrial-scale terror, the journey through the midsummer of 1944 was a slow descent into a green purgatory. The heat began to rise, trapped beneath the canopy of apple orchards and the thick, airless corridors of the sunken lanes. The dust of Normandy, a fine, powdery white silt created by the pulverizing of limestone roads under the weight of Allied treads, rose in choking clouds. It coated everything: the sweat-soaked wool of uniforms, the grease on the rifles, and the very lungs of the men who marched toward the sound of the guns. In this world of the mid-journey, time began to lose its linear quality. Days were measured not by hours but by the number of hedgerows cleared. A single field, barely 100 yards across, could become a soldier's entire universe for a week. The men developed a profound, almost spiritual relationship with the earth. To dig a foxhole in Norman clay was an act of survival that required the strength of an ox and the precision of a mason. They learned to read the roots. The thick, stubborn oak roots provided overhead cover, while the sandy patches meant easier digging but less protection from the tree bursts. Artillery shells that exploded in the branches above, raining jagged steel and splintered wood down into the trenches. The sensory landscape of the journey was dominated by the smell of decay. It was the Norman stench, a cloying, heavy odor that arose from the thousands of dead cattle fat lay bloated in the fields. Caught in the crossfire of a war they could not understand, the soldiers would wrap damp handkerchiefs around their faces to block the smell. It permeated the very food they ate. Yet, amidst this grim reality, there were moments of staggering pastoral beauty. A soldier might find himself crouching in a field of wild poppies, their brilliant red petals a shocking contrast to the drab olive of his sleeves. He might look up to see a hawk circling in the thermal vents of a burning farmhouse, indifferent to the ack-ack of the anti-aircraft guns. The culture of the journey was one of enforced minimalism. Every ounce of weight was scrutinized. Soldiers began to discard anything that wasn't essential for the next hour of life. Gas masks were thrown into the ditches, their canisters repurposed as waterproof containers for letters from home. The iconic M1 helmet, often used as a wash basin, a hammer, or a seat, became a man's most prized possession. They lived in a state of perpetual dampness, even in the heat. The morning dew in the bocage was so heavy it soaked through boots and softened the skin of the feet until it peeled away in white strips. They traded cigarettes for eggs from silent farmers and learned the art of liberating a bottle of cider from a cellar without alerting the sergeant. As the Allied line slowly curved toward the city of Caen and the vital crossroads of Saint-Lay, the nature of the German resistance evolved. The static divisions of Thebich had been replaced by the elite SS and Panzer units, men who had been forged in the fires of the Eastern Front. These were the masters of the counterattack. No sooner would an American platoon capture a farmhouse than a Tiger tank would emerge from the shadows of a nearby wood, its 88mm gun barking with a sound that felt like a physical slap to the face. The Tiger was a mythic beast in the minds of the infantry, a boxy, iron monster that seemed impervious to the light anti-tank guns of the Americans. The only way to kill it was to get close, to crawl through the muck with a sticky bomb or a bazooka, a task that required a cold, mechanical kind of bravery. Communication during this journey was a fragile thing. Field telephones were connected by miles of thin wire that was constantly being severed by tank treads or shell splinters. Signalmen would have to crawl out into no man's land in the dead of night, running their fingers along the wire to find the break, listening for the click of a German wiretap. The radio operators, carrying the heavy walkie-talkies on their backs, were the primary targets for snipers. To carry a radio was to carry a bullseye. They spoke in a coded language of Sugar Abel Baker, their voices hushed and urgent, trying to bridge the gap between the chaos of the front line and the distant, unseen artillery batteries that waited for their coordinates. The journey was also a psychological transformation. The Green Troops who had landed on June 6 were now combat effective, a military term that masked their hardening of the soul. They had seen their friends vanish in a puff of smoke. They had heard the cries of medic echoing through the orchards until the voices went thin and they developed the 1,000-yard stare, a hollow, fixed gaze that looked through people rather than at them. They no longer talked about winning the war in the abstract. They talked about reaching the next hedgerow, the next barn, the next cup of coffee. The world had shrunk to the size of a rifle sight. Logistics. The great silent engine of the invasion continued to churn behind them. The Red Ball Express, a fleet of thousands of trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers, began to roar across the French roads. They drove with their headlights off in the dark, weaving through the craters and the wreckage to bring the beans and bullets to the front. Without this constant pulse of supplies, the journey would have ground to a halt within a week. The French roads, designed for horse-drawn carts, were banged on by the sheer volume of American steel. The very geography of Normandy was being rewritten by the wheels of the GMC de Sanderhof trucks. As Part 4 draws to a close, the Allied forces are finally emerging from the densest parts of the book. The ground is beginning to rise into the Suicide Flats and the high ridges that overlook the city of St. Lin. The air is thick with the anticipation of a major breakthrough Operation Cobra. The journey has been a test of endurance, a slow, bloody crawl through a garden of thorns. But ahead, the horizon is beginning to open up. The trees are thinning, the hills are becoming steeper, and the sound of the German artillery is growing more desperate. The journey of the infantry is about to collide with the climax of the campaign, where the fate of the German 7th Army will be decided in a final, fiery encirclement. The transition from the claustrophobic crawl of the hedgerows to the whites of the breakthrough was marked by a sound that the soldiers would later describe as the sky itself being torn in half. It was late July, and the heat had become a stagnant, shimmering weight over the valley of the Voyer. The journey was over. The climax had begun. To break the deadlock of the bocage, the Allied commando unleashed the full, terrifying weight of their aerial supremacy. Thousands of heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, surged over the horizon in a silver tide that blotted out the sun. The earth did not just shake, it rippled. For the men on the ground, the carpet bombing of Operation Cobra was a sensory apocalypse. The short bombs, those that fell too close to the American lines, created a landscape of craters so dense that the original geography of the fields vanished entirely. The air became a solid wall of dust, sulfur, and pulverized limestone. In the silence that followed the final bomb, the world was among. Trees had been stripped of their leaves in an instant, standing like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. This was the moment of the climax, the point where the organic resistance of the earth gave way to the sheer, industrial violence of the machine age. Through this dust, the tanks began to roll, but they were no longer cautious. They were the spearheads of a breakout that was moving with a new, frantic velocity. General Patton's Third Army had been activated, and with it came a style of warfare that favored speed over safety. The Cobra was striking. The German lines, which had held with such tenacity for weeks, began to fracture. It was no longer a war of hedgerows, but a war of the pocket. The German 7th Army was being pushed into a narrow corridor near the town of Falaise, a closing throat of land that would become a graveyard of an empire. The Falaise pocket was the climax of the Norman nightmare. As the British and Canadians pushed from the north and the Americans surged from the south, a gap of only a few miles remained. Into this gap, the retreating German army poured a chaotic mass of men, horse-drawn wagons, and the remaining pride of the panzer divisions. The light artillery and air forces zeroed in on this bottleneck. The result was a scene of concentrated destruction that even the most hardened veterans turned their heads away. The roads were choked with the charred husks of trucks and the tangled remains of thousands of horses, their legs pointing stiffly toward the sky. The climax was not just found in the grand movements of armies, but in the final, desperate stands, in the ruins of towns like Sentries. Here, the combat returned to the intimate scale of the stone wall and the doorway. The city, once a beautiful hub of Norman life, had been reduced to a heap of rubble and dust. Soldiers fought for individual rooms, moving through the holes blown in the walls of houses. The smell here was different from the fields. It was the smell of ancient plaster, cold soot, and the metallic scent of blood on stone. In the basement of a ruined cathedral, the flickering light of a candle would reveal soldiers from both sides huddling in the same shadows, too exhausted by the climax of the violence to even raise their rifles. The weather, which had governed the invasion since the start, returned with a vengeance. Summer storms broke over the Falaise Gap, turning the roads into rivers of black mud. The climax was a wet, miserable affair. Tanks slid off the embankments, and the wounded lay in the mire, their bandages turning the color of the earth. But the momentum could not be stopped. The war was gone. The bocage was behind. The German army in the west was being liquidated in a whirlwind of fire, and as the gap finally closed, the silence that fell over the valley was heavier than the sound of the guns. It was the silence of a total victory, bought at a price that the landscape would bear for a century. On the final hours of the climax, the focus shifted toward the east, toward Paris. The longest day had turned into the longest summer, and the soldiers who had landed on the sand were now different men. They stood on the ridges overlooking the Seine, their faces hollowed out by the experience, their uniforms a patchwork of repairs. They looked at their hands and saw the stains of Normandy that would never truly wash away. The climax had reached its peak. The German retreat was now a rout. The road to the Rhine was opening. But as the soldiers looked toward the distant horizon, they knew the end of this story was merely the beginning of another, even darker chapter. The climax was over. The fever of the invasion had broken. The fields of Normandy, once seethed center of the world's attention, were being left behind as the steel river of the Allied army flowed toward the borders of the Reich. The sounds of the battle, the buzzsaw of the machine guns, the cricket of the paratroopers, the thud of the falling ramsware fading into the echoes of history, leaving behind a silence that would soon be filled by the cold winds of a coming winter. The resolution of the Normandy campaign did not arrive with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a slow, heavy realization that the world had fundamentally shifted its axis. As ephemeral remnants of the German 7th Army vanished into the prisoner of war pens or lay silent in the tall grass of the Falaise Gap, a strange and hollow peace began to settle over the orchards of Calvados. The violence, which had been as constant as the tide for over 2 months, began to ebb, retreating toward the German frontier and leaving behind a landscape that was unrecognizable. The stone walls of the farmhouses were pockmarked by millions of small arms rounds, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the ghostly resonance of the millions of shells that had passed through it. For the men who had survived from the first light of June 6 to the waning heat of late, the resolution was a quiet, internal process. They sat by the sides of the roads they had bled to open, watching the endless columns of fresh troops and shiny undented trucks roll eastward. These new men looked at the veterans with a mixture of awe and fear. They saw the way the D-Day survivors moved with a slow their eyes perpetually narrowed as if still searching the horizon for the flash of an 88. The veterans didn't talk much about the glory of the liberation. Instead, they cleaned their rifles with a mechanical, obsessive devotion, their fingers moving over thistle and walnut in a silent prayer of gratitude for the tools that had seen them through on the villages. The resolution took the form of a fragile, bittersweet homecoming. The French civilians emerged from their cellars and the deep woods, blinking in the unaccustomed sunlight. They began the agonizing work of sorting through the rubble of their lives. A family might find a single porcelain teacup intact amidst the ruins of a 400-year-old manor. A farmer might discover his favorite plow horse had survived the bombardment by hiding in a deep ravine. There were celebrations. Yes, bottles of hidden wine were unearthed and shared with the passing Amos, but the laughter always had a sharp, brittle edge. They were standing in a graveyard of empires, and the scent of the liberation was forever mingled with the scent of the smoke that still rose from the blackened beams of their barns. The resolution of the great secret was now complete. The Atlantic Wall, that mythic barrier of concrete and hubris, was now nothing more than a series of curiosities for theological children to explore. The massive bunkers at Long-sur-Mer and Pointe-du-Hoc sat silent, their great guns twisted and blackened, looking out over a sea that was once again empty of warships. The tide continued to come in and go out, washing away the footprints of the millions of men who had scrambled across the sand, but it could not wash away the memory. The beaches, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, were becoming names on a map of history, transitioning from places of living agony to places of eternal pilgrimage. As the Allied armies reached the banks of the Seine and the outskirts of Paris, the strategic resolution of Operation Overlord became clear. The back of the Germany occupation had been broken. The 1,000-year Reich was now a retreating shadow, its dreams of global hegemony buried in the mud of the boat. But for the individual soldier, the resolution was more humble. It was the first full night of sleep without the fear of a mortar round. It was the first letter home that could say, with some degree of I am safe for now. They realized that they were the lucky ones, the ones who had been allowed to see the end of the longest summer, while so many of their brothers remained behind in the silent, white-crossed fields of Colville. The resolution also brought a new kind of clarity to the world. The map of Europe was being redrawn in real time, and the soldiers could feel the gravity of history pulling them further away from the familiar. The English Channel, once the terrifying obstacle of June 5, was now a distant memory. The war was no longer about a beach, it was about the heart of Germany. Yet, as they moved forward, they carried the soul of Normandy with them. They carried the lessons of the hedgerows, the resilience of the paratroopers, and the grim determination of the landing craft. They had become the greatest generation, not by choice, but by the relentless refining fire of the 1944 coastline. The tide eventually retreated from the bloodied sands of Omaha, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to echo across the Atlantic, where yet another shadow was beginning to fall over the map of the East.